I never thought betrayal would come wrapped in the warm smile of my only son, or whispered from the lips of the woman he chose as his wife. I never thought family, the very thing I built my life around, would be the knife pressed against my back, waiting for the perfect moment to push me over the edge. But sometimes life is cruel in ways we can't prepare for. And I learned that lesson the day my daughter-in-law leaned close on the deck of that glittering yacht and murmured, "Say hi to the sharks." Then with a soft shove, she pushed me into the cold Atlantic. The water swallowed me whole. The last thing I saw before the ocean closed over my head was my son David standing on the deck, frozen. He didn't move. He didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He just watched. And in that frozen second, I understood the truth. I had been too blind, too hopeful, too desperate to admit he was in on it. They wanted me dead. I suppose I should have seen it coming. At 67 years old, widowed with more money than I could ever spend in a lifetime, I was the perfect target. And who better to betray me than the two people I'd trusted most after Robert, my husband, passed away? Blood may be thicker than water, but seawater, as it turns out, washes everything away. That morning had begun so beautifully. The sky was crisp blue over Boston Harbor, the air sharp with the smell of salt and possibility. I had dressed carefully, choosing the navy dress Robert once told me made my eyes shine brighter. I wanted to look dignified, resilient, alive. My son had called me personally, not through his assistant, an oddity that should have been my first warning, inviting me for what he described as a celebration cruise. "Just the three of us," he had said, "like a real family again. We want to toast to your recovery." My hip surgery had left me weak, vulnerable, aching in both body and spirit. Recovery was long and lonely. Since Robert's death 2 years earlier, the house had grown quieter by the day, echoing with absence. I had hoped this invitation was a bridge back into my son's world. Foolish, isn't it? A mother will cling to scraps of affection, even when the hands offering them are slick with poison. The yacht was magnificent, 42 feet of gleaming white arrogance, bought with the $3 million I had once given David as seed money for his so-called consulting firm. I should have known it was squandered. I should have asked questions. But I didn't, because love has a way of blinding you to ugly truths. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, greeted me with a smile that could cut glass. Her beauty was the kind that looked better in photographs than in real life: sharp cheekbones, lips that curled more easily in scorn than in kindness. She handed me a mimosa, her manicured fingers grazing mine, and in that brief touch, I felt nothing warm. Only calculation. For the first hour, everything was pleasant. We drifted farther from the Massachusetts coastline, its familiar outline shrinking until the horizon swallowed it. Vanessa chattered about renovations they were planning for the house I had once called my own, the house I had signed over to them after Robert died, believing they would fill it with laughter, with children, with family dinners. Instead, they filled it with greed. It was David who shifted the tone. He began casually, as though the thought had just crossed his mind. "Mom," he said, pouring me another glass of champagne, "have you thought about updating your will, just to simplify things for us, you know? Probate can be complicated." The word hung in the air. Complicated. My heart stiffened. Then I noticed Vanessa's phone angled slyly toward me, its camera glinting in the sun. She wasn't taking selfies. She was recording me. Recording my words, my glass of champagne, my supposed frailty. That's when everything clicked. The power of attorney documents they'd pressured me into signing after my surgery. The financial advisor who had suddenly stopped returning my calls. The conversations David steered toward my health, my memory, my supposed confusion. They weren't caring for me. They were building a case against me. I set my glass down carefully, though my hands trembled. "David," I said quietly, "I'd like to go back to shore now." His mask slipped. His eyes, once warm, went cold as ice. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mom." Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the breeze. "You've been showing signs of dementia," she said sweetly. "We have it documented. Doctors agree you can't manage your financial affairs." It was absurd. I was sharper than both of them put together. But their trap was well laid. My stomach turned to stone. David pulled out papers, legal transfers, power of attorney, signatures they demanded I provide. For your protection, he said, as though murder could be dressed up in concern. I stared at the ocean. It seemed less dangerous than the two people standing in front of me. I met their eyes one after the other and said firmly, "Go to hell." That was when Vanessa leaned close, whispered about the sharks, and shoved me over the railing. The water was a brutal shock. The Atlantic clawed at me, dragging me down its icy grip, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My shoes slipped off in the struggle. My dress wrapped around my legs like seaweed. Above me, I glimpsed the yacht speeding away, the sound of David's false cries, fading Mom. Oh God, Mom. But his voice was hollow. He wasn't mourning. He was celebrating. I fought for the surface, my muscles screaming. The instinct to survive roared louder than the betrayal crushing my heart. I gasped. Air coughed, salt kicked toward nothing but endless blue. That's when I saw it, the silhouette of a fishing boat cutting across the horizon. By some miracle, Captain Jake Morrison spotted me. A man in his 60s, weathered like driftwood, and twice as solid, he hauled me aboard with the strength of someone who had spent a lifetime on the sea. His grandson Tyler helped wrap me in blankets, their hands rough but kind, their eyes wide with disbelief. "What kind of people leave someone floating in the middle of the ocean?" Jake muttered. "The kind who inherit $3 billion if I die," I rasped. And in that moment, I made a decision. If my son and his wife thought they could erase me, they were mistaken. Death had given me a gift, a cloak of invisibility. They believed I was gone, which meant I had the power to move in shadows, to plan to strike back. "I need you not to tell anyone you found me," I begged Jake. He studied me with eyes that had seen storms, wrecks, and tragedies. And then with a slow nod, he said, "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look like following the rules." From that instant, my rebirth began. I was no longer Margaret Harrison, grieving widow, fragile mother, discarded matriarch. I was something sharper, colder. I was a ghost with unfinished business. That night, as David and Vanessa wept crocodile tears before the police reporting their tragic accident at sea, I sat in a stranger's kitchen, warming my hands on a bowl of soup, planning their downfall. They thought they had killed me, but the truth was far more terrifying. I was alive, and I was coming for them. They left me for dead, but the sea spat me back up like a secret it couldn't keep. When Jake eased his fishing skiff into a hidden cove, and Mrs. Chen, who ran a no-questions bed and breakfast, wrapped me in a bowl of steaming chicken broth, I felt the wet, cold shock of betrayal settle into something harder, a plan. Grief still lived under my ribs, of course. Grief for Robert, grief for the life I thought I'd protected with good decisions and quiet generosity. But grief had company now, anger sharp and steady, and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. If they thought drowning me would solve their problem, they hadn't met Margaret Harrison in a crisis. They'd only met the version of me who believed in blood and loyalty. That version was gone. In its place was someone who had been shoved off a yacht and given a second chance to get it right. Mrs. Chen's kitchen was small and smelled of ginger and old wood, a kind of safety that felt absurd and miraculous after the deck's cold betrayal. She ladled soup into a cracked bowl and set it in front of me without speaking, as if she understood that some things can only be fixed with warmth and silence. Jake kept watch by the window cape of weathered leather, and eyes that had seen men justify all manner of sins in the name of money. He listened as I told the story, slowly savoring facts, like a detective tasting evidence. The more I spoke, the more the timeline of their cruelty settled into place, the power of attorney documents they'd shoved at my bedside after surgery, the disappearing calls from my advisor, the way Vanessa had learned to make me look small and forgetful in front of other people. Everything had been engineered to make me helpless, to give them an uncontested path to the keys of everything Robert and I had built. "You in some kind of trouble?" Jake asked finally, not looking surprised. "Fishermen see more of human nature than most of us, I suppose. They see the ways people sink under weight." "Yes," I said, "but it's the kind of trouble where coming back alive is an advantage." He grinned then, a crack through the hard, weathered face. "Now that's the kind of trouble worth helping with." We were careful. Death, or the appearance of it, is an odd permission slip. I could move in places I never could when I was alive and publicly present. Neighbors who would have avoided me now mourned me in the newspaper, handing over condolences, with the practiced detachment of people who attend funerals more out of social obligation than genuine sorrow. My obituary, already drafted by someone who thought they'd won, spoke about declining health and memory issues and included a line about donations to the Alzheimer's Association. Poison the pen said tastes better if it looks charitable. I used a stranger's computer at Mrs. Chen's to read the articles the next morning, to watch how a life could be rewritten by a family who'd rehearsed the lines of grief in front of a mirror. While David performed the bereaved son and Vanessa wept on cue, I started making a list. Names, dates, contacts, people who had access to my finances. The pieces of their scheme were everywhere if you knew where to look. A clinic that handled surrogacy for wealthy clients, a file labeled Margaret Project, a series of medical appointments where I'd been coached into appearing confused. The pattern wasn't the work of amateurs. Someone with legal knowledge and medical connections had helped craft this. My throat went tight when I saw a note signed only MT recommending that I be moved to Phase 3, my death, because I'd started asking questions. There was a cold, methodical cruelty to it that made my stomach turn. "Who's MT?" I asked Jake, but Mrs. Chen already had an answer. She knew of a private investigator named Danny who owed her a favor. Private investigators are a blessing for people who have run out of safe hands to trust. Danny met me over coffee above a sandwich shop, the kind of place where you can talk and not worry about being overheard. He was a former cop, flat voice, sharp eyes. I had cash in an envelope from a safety deposit box Robert had insisted on keeping for emergencies, a soft little insurance policy that suddenly felt like the only honest thing I still possessed. Danny took the envelope without comment and started to work. Within hours, he had photos, license plate numbers, and a name, Miranda Torres. She wasn't just a lawyer. She had built an entire practice around families with fissured relationships and large estates. She called it family transition planning. In plain English, she helped people accelerate inheritances, sometimes through means that were disturbingly final. Danny's face hardened when he explained he had reason to believe Miranda had been working with David and Vanessa for months. The funeral was the theater of their deceit. I sat behind a maintenance shed with a pair of borrowed binoculars while David and Vanessa took their bows. The casket was empty, but the performance was not. Professional mourners, or perhaps true friends, gave speeches and condolences, and I watched them accept pity with the smugness of people who expect the world to rearrange itself for them. I watched their faces when someone asked too many probing questions, saw the practiced way they diverted attention. I watched them collect faces for the cameras to record faces that would say later that they had loved me until the last breath. The worst part was seeing people I actually loved lined up to grieve for me, unaware they were mourning a version of me the world would never really know. Danny delivered more than photographs. He found a birth certificate and medical billing for a newborn, a baby Harrison. The name should have filled me with warmth. Instead, it made bile rise in my throat. The timing didn't add up. Vanessa had not given birth 3 weeks ago. She had been on that yacht with me when she shoved me over the rail. The certificate was clean, well-prepared, and suspiciously convenient. It fit the narrative like a glove. A newborn heir who would inherit whatever fortune was left if David was designated as primary beneficiary. But who had given birth? Who was this baby? There was a darker possibility that twisted in my chest. What if the baby wasn't theirs by blood? What if someone had been bought or worse created as a legal instrument to secure inheritance? Danny's next lead pushed me into another kind of fury. The surrogacy clinic Whitmore Reproductive Services had been paid in cash, and the records showed arrangements made through a name linked to Miranda Torres. A 17-year-old, a runaway from Maine, named Sarah Collins, had been listed as the birth mother. According to a nurse who had spoken to Danny, Sarah had been healthy. Suddenly, the idea that a teenage woman had died in delivery on the other side of a transaction made my blood run cold. The scheme had teeth. It was not just legal contortion. It was exploitation and possibly murder dressed as medical complication. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked that night as we scrawled everything across Mrs. Chen's maple table. The plan crystallized there in ink and fear. It was reckless, probably foolish, and entirely necessary. I would go back to the house that had been mine for 35 years not to reclaim real estate, but to reclaim the narrative. I would make them believe they had won. Then I would make them watch every piece of their victory crumble. We moved in measured steps. Danny set up surveillance. Carol Peterson, the kind nurse who had been hired to care for the baby, was quietly spoken to, and once she understood what she was caring for, she became my ally. She didn't know the full extent of David and Vanessa's crimes at first. She only knew she had a job and a baby in her care. When I showed her the evidence, the forged documents, the timeline mapped out in meticulous handwriting, she began to tremble with something like righteous anger. A nurse's oath has a strange way of turning terror into duty. The plan to haunt them, to unsettle them psychologically, came from the simple truth that people who lie are brittle. They make mistakes under pressure. I wrote a note, elegant stationery, a small provocation, and had Jake deliver it to Miranda's office, while David and Vanessa were meeting with her. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, it read. A small joke, but a missile. When the note arrived, Danny had photographs of the meeting. I watched them run from Miranda's office like hunted animals, and for the first time since the yacht, something like justice felt possible. I wasn't aiming for melodrama, I was aiming for exposure. David and Vanessa had built their life on plausible explanations and rehearsed grief. Strip those away, and you have people exposed for what they are: frightened, selfish, and dangerously inventive. Carol agreed to continue caring for the baby while documenting everything. Mrs. Chen knitted in the corner and made discreet trips to the post office, and Jake kept a boat on call. Danny expanded his net. Miranda Torres had clients, and clients had associates and shared bank accounts. The opera of crime was not just a family play. It was a small, efficient machine, and we were about to throw a stone into its gears. When I finally walked back through the door of my old house, quiet, dignified, perfectly alive in the chair Robert had bought me all those years ago, I felt the exact mixture of cold pleasure and sick sorrow I had imagined 1,000 times. Watching the faces of the people who had tried to erase me was almost intoxicating. But the real work was only beginning. They had assumed my death would erase their caution. They had underestimated the force of a grandmother's love for a baby she had not known yet would protect as fiercely as her own life. I had a list of crime's witnesses, and a few allies who understood that sometimes justice arrives in the body of someone who refuses to be forgotten. They thought they'd sealed my fate with a shove. They'd only opened a door that let the truth rush out. The look on their faces when they found me in my old armchair was worth every drop of seawater I had swallowed. Vanessa's scream cracked through the house like a pane of glass shattering in slow motion. David just stood there, pale, his mouth working silently like a fish on a dock. For the first time in days, I felt steady. Their world was tilting. Mine was bracing itself for war. "Hello, darlings," I said, my voice calm, almost pleasant. "How was your meeting?" Vanessa staggered back as if she'd seen a ghost. And perhaps she had. David's keys clattered to the floor. The smell of flowers from the funeral still clung to their clothes. It mixed in the air with something acrid fear. They'd built an empire of lies in the span of a week, and in 1 second, with my voice alone, I'd sent the whole structure trembling. Carol appeared then, carrying the baby. She stood in the doorway, nervous, unsure if this was bravery or madness. I stretched out my arms, and when the tiny weight of him settled against me, something inside me shifted. His eyes were dark, curious, innocent. He knew nothing of inheritance, nothing of blood soaked in betrayal. He was only life, pure, demanding, relentless life. "This is my grandson," I whispered. "Not your property, not your pawn." Vanessa found her voice, then sharp and brittle. "He's ours. Our son. We decide what he's called. We decide his future." I looked her in the eye, the baby pressed close to my chest. "Do you tell me, Vanessa, when exactly did you give birth?" 4 days ago, you stood on that yacht in a silk dress, no sign of stitches, no hint of recovery. Are you a miracle worker, or are you simply a liar?" Her lips trembled. David opened his mouth, closed. It opened it again. He looked young suddenly, not like a man, but like the boy I had once raised, the boy who scraped his knees on sidewalks and came crying for comfort. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who had tried to erase me for $3 billion. I laid out the evidence one piece at a time, photographs forged, documents the timeline of my supposed decline. Miranda Torres's name surfaced again and again, her signature a scar on my life. I watched the color drain from David's face as I spoke, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought he might break, that he might fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. But greed runs deeper than blood. It had carved him hollow. "You can accuse us of anything," Vanessa hissed finally, "but proof you have none." "Oh, darling," I said softly, "you shouldn't have said that." I pulled the recorder from Robert's desk drawer. Its little red light blinked like a heartbeat. "Massachusetts is a one-party consent state," I told them. "Every word you've spoken is now preserved, your denials, your hesitations, your half-admissions. Every word will live long enough to put you behind bars." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the baby's soft sigh against my shoulder. "What do you want?" David whispered. I looked at him, my only son, the man who had carried both my name and my trust. "What do I want? I want justice. I want Sarah Collins, the 17-year-old girl who carried this baby, to have her story told, not buried beneath your lies. I want this child raised in truth, not in greed. I want Miranda Torres dismantled, her empire of death exposed to the light. And I want you to live with the knowledge that you tried to kill your mother for money." I gave them 24 hours to decide whether they would cooperate. But I already knew the answer. They had chosen their path the moment Vanessa pressed her palm to my back and pushed. By dawn the next day, Danny was on the phone with urgent news. "They've hired someone," he said grimly. "They call him the cleaner, professional efficient. He doesn't just cover up mistakes, he erases them." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My son hadn't chosen remorse, he had chosen murder. Again, we fled to a safe house on a private island, the sea my reluctant ally once more. The air there was clean, the silence broken only by gulls, but peace was a luxury I couldn't afford. I wrote down every detail I remembered, names, dates, shadows of conversations. If they found me again, the truth would survive even if I didn't. Then Danny returned with news that twisted the knife. The cleaner was dead. A bullet to the head, execution style. Miranda Torres had decided her pawns were expendable. She was tying off loose ends, and that included David, Vanessa, and me. And worse, it included the baby. The thought of them touching him, of snuffing out his life for convenience, made something inside me ignite. Rage, yes, but also resolve. "We have to get him out," I said, my voice breaking. "He's the only innocent in this. I won't let him die because of their greed." Jake shook his head. "It's too dangerous. They'll be watching the house." "Then let them watch," I said. "Let them think I'm coming to bargain. Let them think they've won. They'll never see the trap closing." We set the plan in motion with a precision born from desperation. Carol planted hidden microphones. Danny placed cameras. Jake stood ready with his boat. And I, foolish, stubborn, unbreakable, was the bait. When I walked up the steps of my old house that evening, the sky bleeding red with sunset, David opened the door. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. "Mom," he whispered, and for the briefest moment, I saw the boy again, standing in the wreckage of his own making. But that boy was long gone. Inside, Vanessa paced, her nerves shredded. "She'll be here soon," she muttered. "Torres wants to talk to you." The clock ticked. My heart beat against my ribs like a drum, and then the door opened. Miranda Torres walked in, smaller than I expected, neat and professional, like a neighbor you might ask to water your plants. She smiled as if we were meeting at a charity gala. "Mrs. Harrison," she said smoothly, "I'm so glad you survived. We have much to discuss." Her voice was calm, practiced, polished, but I could hear the blade beneath it. Miranda sat across from me as though we were equals at a business negotiation, her leather portfolio resting neatly on her lap. She crossed one leg over the other, her suit pressed, her perfume faint but sharp. Everything about her radiated control. And yet, beneath that poise, I could feel the chill of something monstrous. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble for my clients." she said, her tone soft as though she were scolding a child. David and Vanessa followed my instructions precisely, and yet here you are, very much alive, very much disruptive. I kept my hands folded on my lap, steady though my heart was pounding. Murder tends to be disruptive, I said. She tilted her head, amused. Murder is such a crude word. I prefer to think of what we do as compassionate intervention. Estate planning acceleration. We provide families relief from the chaos of decline. We give them freedom, peace of mind, resources. And the elderly? She shrugged. They pass on with dignity, remembered for who they were, not the burden they became. My stomach twisted, but I didn't flinch. You mean you kill them? She smiled as if humoring a stubborn patient. We resolve situations. In the past 5 years alone, I've helped 37 families avoid prolonged suffering, 37 legacies preserved. 37. The number struck me like a slap. 37 fathers, mothers, grandmothers, people who had lived lives full of stories, laughter, sorrows, and triumphs, all erased their deaths, sanitized and filed away as accidents. 37 people who had trusted their families only to be betrayed for money. And now me, I asked, voice low. Oh, Mrs. Harrison, she said smoothly. You'll be number 39. There was another matter resolved earlier today. A man who asked too many questions. I glanced at David and Vanessa, who sat rigid on the sofa, faces pale, lips pressed tight. They looked like children waiting to be scolded. Miranda spoke of my death as though it were already inked into her calendar, nothing more than another item to cross off a list. And the baby, I asked quietly. She didn't even blink. Loose ends complicate matters. Infants are tragically fragile. A faulty furnace, a carbon monoxide leak, people will grieve, but no one will question. Something inside me snapped. Rage, raw and uncontainable, surged through my veins. That baby, I said, my voice breaking, is the only innocent thing left in this entire nightmare. And you would kill him too. Neither David nor Vanessa answered. They just stared at the floor, complicit in silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake them, demand to know when greed had consumed them so completely that their own child, or the child they had purchased to be their heir, had become expendable. But instead I smiled. For the first time since Miranda entered the room, I smiled. Miss Torres, I said softly, there's something you should know. Her eyebrow arched, curious. And what's that? You're under arrest. The house exploded with movement. Doors burst open, windows crashed inward, and shadows surged into the room with guns raised and voices thundering commands. FBI jackets filled the space like a wave. Miranda's calm facade cracked for the first time as she leapt from her chair, bolting toward the kitchen. She made it 3 steps before 3 agents tackled her, slamming her portfolio to the floor. David and Vanessa sat frozen, their faces drained of color. The world they had built of lies, fraud, betrayal was collapsing in front of their eyes. Agent Chen, sharp-eyed and unflinching, turned to me. Mrs. Harrison, she said, that was extremely dangerous. And extremely well done. I exhaled, my body shaking with relief I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Danny Crawford stepped out from the shadows, then no longer just the private investigator I'd hired. He flashed his badge. Former FBI, he explained with a small smile. Been working undercover on Torres's network for 2 years. We needed her confession. You gave it to us. Miranda was dragged out in cuffs, still protesting, still trying to weave her lies into something resembling sense. But her words no longer mattered. Every syllable she had spoken had been recorded. 37 murders, plans for 2 more, an entire empire of deceit shattered in one night. Carol appeared, then, baby in her arms, eyes wet with tears. Is it over? She whispered. I reached for the child, cradling him against me, as if the world could no longer touch him. His small hand wrapped around my finger, and I felt my heart swell with something fierce, protective, unshakable. Yes, I said, at least the dangerous part. The legal battle stretched for months. Trials, testimonies, depositions. David and Vanessa traded their silence for plea deals, 25 years for him, 20 for her. I attended every hearing, not to savor their downfall, but to remind myself that choices carry weight. They had chosen betrayal. They had chosen greed. And now they would carry that choice for the rest of their lives. Miranda Torres went to trial and was convicted on every count: murder, fraud, elder, abuse, racketeering. Life without parole. Her empire unraveled, exposing a web of corrupt doctors, judges, and financial advisors. 17 more arrests followed. The scheme had stolen over $200 million from the elderly across 6 states. But now the shadows had been dragged into the light. And through it all, the baby Robert Sarah remained the center of my world. I legally adopted him with the blessing of Sarah Collins's distant relatives. His name carries 3 legacies: Robert after his grandfather, Sarah after his brave young mother, Harrison because love makes a family stronger than blood ever could. Today, 5 years later, I am 72, and Robert Sarah is a bright-eyed boy who knows his story. He knows about Sarah Collins, the teenager who gave him life and lost hers too soon. He knows about Robert, the grandfather whose name he carries like a shield. And he knows about me, the grandmother who refused to die when death was the easy option. Sometimes he asks me why his parents are in prison. I tell him the truth because sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones you must protect yourself from. It is not the lesson I ever wanted to give, but it is the one life forced upon us. Mrs. Chen still runs her little inn, now quietly known as a safe haven, for those who suspect their families may not have their best interests at heart. Jake still sails the sea, a local legend who once pulled a woman back from the jaws of betrayal. And Danny Agent Crawford sends Christmas cards with photos of other lives saved because one woman refused to sink. David writes me letters sometimes. He says he was manipulated, that he was weak, that he never truly meant to hurt me. He asks for forgiveness. I never write back. Some silences are the only answer left. What I learned in that week as a dead woman is this: family is not blood. Family is not obligation or inheritance. Family is the people who show up when you are drowning, who throw you a rope instead of a stone. Family is love chosen daily, not stolen with signatures and schemes. Robert, Sarah, and I, we are family now. And it is a family without yachts, without sharks, without knives hidden behind smiles. It is the family I wish I'd known sooner, the family I fought the ocean to keep. So if you are listening, if you are watching, let my story be a warning. Betrayal may shove you into the coldest waters, but survival gives you power. Survival gives you choice. And sometimes survival gives you a second chance to define what family really means. If my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what does family mean to you? Because your voice matters.